Hello. Today we're going to take a look at a mixed bag drill of factoring and how to look at a problem and decide which method you should use to start to factor it. Let's go. So when your equation only has two terms, usually one of two things is going on. Either it is a difference of squares or cubes, or you're going to be able to simplify it by pulling out the greatest common factor. So I'm going to draw our attention to this equation first, and I'm going to notice I have an x squared and an x term, but I have no constant term. At this point, rejoice because life just got a lot easier. This is the example of working with the greatest common factor. So I look in this term and in this term, I see each of them has an x that I can factor out, and each of them has a, yep, that's right, a 7. So I will factor out a 7x, and I want to remind you the word factor really means division. So when I factor 7x out of 7x squared or divide 7x out of 7x squared, I'm left with, that's right, x. And when I factor 7x out of 28x, I'm left with, that's right, 4. And that whole thing was equal to 0. And now I use the zero product property, which tells me that if one thing times another thing equals 0, that only happens when the first thing or the second thing equals 0. And now I just go ahead and solve for x. So here I'm going to divide both sides by 7, and 0 divided by 7 is 0. And here I'm going to subtract 4 from both sides. So x equals 0 and x equals 4 is how to factor and solve that equation. Now, if I look at this side of the board, the first thing I want to do to be able to see things more clearly, I do not want to deal with this 1/3. That is confusing to me. So I'm going to do something called multiplying through. And what that means is, since I can do the same thing to both sides of my equation and it will stay the same, I am going to multiply the whole equation by 3 because that will turn my 1/3 into a 1, right? I'm going to multiply by the reciprocal. So I'm going to multiply 3 into each term. 3 times 3x squared is 9x squared. 3 times negative 1/3 is negative 1. And 3 times 0 is 0. All right, now when I look at this, I see I have a difference, and I see that 9x squared is 3x squared, and that 1 is 1 squared, so I have a difference of squares. If you don't remember how to factor difference of squares, check out this video. Otherwise, we are going to remember that my first factor will be a positive, my second factor will be a negative. It doesn't matter which direction, you could flip those. But my first term in both parentheses is the square root of this first term. So that puts a 3x there. And my second term in both parentheses is the square root of my second term there. And so the difference of squares factoring of this is 3x plus 1, 3x minus 1. Now I use my zero product property again to say that that only happens if my first or my second is equal to 0. And now I go ahead and solve by subtracting 1 on this side and dividing by 3 to get negative 1/3, adding 1 and dividing by 3 to get positive 1/3. All right, let's look at our next two examples. In this example, we have 4 terms, and one of them is a cubed. First thing we're going to check is there anything common to all 4 terms? The answer is no. This one doesn't have an x. These 3 are all divisible by 4, but 9 is not. We do not have anything common. Our next step when we have 4 terms is to group. If this isn't familiar to you, go check out this video on factoring by grouping. But otherwise, here's what we're going to do. We are going to put brackets around the first 2 terms and the second 2. Notice I included the negative in this bracket. Now I'm going to look at each of these for the greatest common factor. And in these 2 terms, I see I can pull a 9 out of both numbers, and I can pull an x squared out of both variable parts. So that would look like this. And again, I'm asking myself division. 9x cubed divided by 9x squared leaves x, and negative 36x squared divided by 9x squared leaves, don't forget your negative, negative 4. Now I do the same thing here, and I don't want to have a negative left inside. So when I look for my greatest common factor, I am going to pull that negative out and divide negative 4 out of both. Negative 4x divided by negative 4 leaves positive 16 divided by negative 4 leaves negative 4. And the reason I pulled that negative 4 instead of just 4 is because I need what's inside my parentheses to be the same. If I had just pulled 4 out, I would have negative x plus 4, and that wouldn't work for this next step. So now, since I have the same thing in parentheses, I'm going to pull it out of both terms. When I say pull, that means factor. And I'm left with 9x squared from my first term minus 4 from my second term. All right, almost done. But now I have a factor with 2 terms here that looks awfully suspicious for difference of squares. 9 is something squared. X squared is something squared. 4 is something squared. This can be further factored. I bring my x minus 4 down. I'm going to put my 2 sets of parentheses there. A plus in one, a minus in the other. This first term is the square root of this. This second term is the square root of that. Now I am fully factored and I can come up with my 3 answers, setting each of these things equaling to 0 and solving. And those are my 3 solutions. All right, final problem of this set. First thing to notice, this doesn't say equals 0. That's not helpful. Manipulate it so it says equals 0. All right, and notice I popped this not over here, but in descending order of degree of x. All right, now I'm looking at a quadratic equation, an x squared, an x, and a constant, and now I've got my choice. I could put all these numbers into the quadratic formula. And if I've got a calculator, that's probably my fastest way to go. If I am not allowed to use a calculator on my test, then I might choose to use the X method. And by the way, if the quadratic formula is not familiar to you, check out this video. And if the X method is not familiar to you, check out this video. Otherwise, continuing on, what goes up here is C times A. So that's what goes down here is B. And now I'm asking myself what multiplies to 105 and adds to negative 38. So I'm going to make a quick factor list. And when I look through my factor list, I see 3 and 35 can come together to add to a negative 38 if they're both negative and multiply to a positive 105. And now I remember that because my coefficient of my x squared is not 1, these are not my final answers. These are the coefficients of my 2 x terms in my FOIL. So I finish up with a quick factoring by grouping. And to remind you, my first term and my last term are taken right out of my equation. My middle term is where I utilize what I came up with in my factoring by x method. Now I'm going to group just like we did in the other problem. And I'm pulling out my greatest common factor. So over here, that's a 3x. And over here, again, I've got a leading negative, so I want to pull that out. So that'll be a negative 5. And yay, what's left are the same thing. So now I finish by pulling that out. And all of those equal to 0 all the way along. So now I finish with my 0 product property, set each of these equal to 0 and solve to find x equals 1/7 and x equals 5/3, which is what you would get if you worked this through on your calculator. So 4 different factoring problems, 4 different methods based on what the equation looks like. Watch this again, press pause, solve along with me. Take a look at my factoring playlist. Consider subscribing to my channel so you know when I put out a new video. And as always, keep on mathing.